The morning I opened the workshop door and saw what lay on the sawdust floor, my knees nearly gave out beneath me. I had to grip the frame of that old barn door, the one my father had hung in 1962, just to keep myself upright. 43 years working wood in Alberta, winters had taught me a man could survive almost anything if he kept his hands busy enough. But that morning, standing in my workshop outside Red Deer, I felt a kind of fear that settled deep into the bones. My name is Walter Bergstrom. I'm 67 years old, retired from the oil patch after 3 decades up near Fort McMurray. After my wife Margaret died from cancer in 2021, the workshop behind our bungalow became the only place that still felt alive to me. That shop sat on 60 acres my father bought after the war, creek in the back, black walnut trees along the far end of the property, trees my father planted himself with dirt still under his fingernails from Europe. Those trees mattered to me, maybe more than they should have. My daughter Caroline used to joke that I cared about those walnut trees like they were family. Truth is, after Margaret passed, maybe they were. Caroline lived down in Calgary with her husband Trevor, a commercial real estate man with polished boots and expensive watches, and a smile that always seemed half a second too rehearsed. I never trusted him. Not fully. Trevor was the kind of man who always had a great opportunity for somebody else's money or somebody else's land. Margaret used to tell me not to judge him too harshly for Caroline's sake, so I kept my mouth shut and watched quietly. That Tuesday started ordinary enough. I drove into town to buy myself a proper set of chisels from Home Hardware. Lee Valley Steel. Cost nearly $400, which felt reckless for an old widower living on pension checks, but for the first time in months, I actually wanted to build something beautiful again. I was standing at the register with my coffee in one hand when I noticed the elderly woman ahead of me counting coins onto the counter with shaking fingers. She had a can of wood stain, some sandpaper, and a brass hinge. $12 short. The cashier looked uncomfortable. The woman looked embarrassed. So I stepped forward and told the boy to put her things on my bill too. Simple as that. But the moment she turned and looked at me, something felt strange. Her eyes were pale gray, sharp, watching me like she already knew who I was. "You are a kind man," she said softly. "What is your name?" "Walter Bergstrom," I told her. The second she heard my last name, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Out in the parking lot, just before she walked away, she grabbed my forearm with a grip far too strong for someone her age. Then she whispered something that turned my blood cold. "Your daughter's husband is coming to your workshop this week," she said. "When he does, let him take whatever he wants." I stared at her, completely lost. But then she leaned closer. "And, Walter, after he leaves, do not sweep the sawdust off your floor, no matter what you see." She walked away before I could ask another question. And standing there beside my truck, with the prairie wind moving across the parking lot, I suddenly had the feeling that something terrible had already started moving toward me. If you've ever ignored a bad feeling and regretted it later, subscribe to the channel, because some warnings only make sense when it's already too late. For the next 2 days, I convinced myself the old woman had simply lost her bearings. People get lonely out here on the prairies. Age does strange things to memory. By Wednesday evening, I had almost stopped thinking about her completely. Then Thursday came. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the low growl of a diesel engine climbing my laneway. I looked out the kitchen window and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Trevor's black Ram 3500 rolled to a stop beside my workshop, with a flatbed trailer rattling behind it. Another man sat in the passenger seat, heavy-set, wearing a dark hoodie pulled over his head. Trevor climbed out smiling like we were old friends. "Walter," he called, "hope I'm not interrupting anything." I stepped outside slowly. Duke followed close behind me. "What's going on?" I asked. Trevor shoved his hands into his coat pockets and glanced toward the walnut stand near the creek. "I've got a client building a custom place up in Canmore," he said casually. "Architect wants premium black walnut, live edge stuff. I told him you've got some incredible trees out here." Then came that salesman's smile. I figured maybe I could take a few logs as samples. Samples. A man doesn't bring a flatbed trailer and a stranger for samples. And right then, the old woman's voice came rushing back into my head. "Let him take whatever he wants." Every instinct in me wanted to tell him no. Those trees belonged to my father before they belonged to me. I had spent decades protecting them from storms, beetles, and careless machinery. But instead I swallowed my pride and nodded. "Chainsaw's hanging beside the shed," I told him. "Watch the fence line near the creek." Trevor looked almost surprised at how easy it was. That should have warned me more than anything. They disappeared down the back trail while I stayed in the workshop, pretending to sand down a bookshelf. But I wasn't working. I was listening. The chainsaw started 20 minutes later. Then it kept going. And going. By the time they finally returned, the trailer carried 3 massive walnut logs, each one worth thousands. They had butchered the cuts, too. Fast, sloppy, like thieves trying to leave before daylight. Trevor waved from the driver's window. Then suddenly he parked beside the workshop again. "You mind if we grab something to eat before heading back?" he asked. "Long drive." "Help yourself." The 2 men went inside. At first I stayed near the workshop door, watching through the kitchen window. The stranger heated up leftover stew, but Trevor didn't touch the food. Instead, he walked quietly down the hallway toward my spare room, toward the filing cabinet. My chest tightened instantly. He stayed there several minutes before casually returning to the kitchen, like nothing had happened. They ate quickly, laughed about something, then left. I watched their taillights disappear into the falling darkness. The whole property suddenly felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I checked the filing cabinet immediately after they left, but nothing looked disturbed at first glance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened while my back was turned. Then I remembered the warning. "Do not sweep the sawdust." I walked slowly back to the workshop and flicked on the overhead lights. Fresh sawdust covered the floor from my own work earlier that day. Normally I swept before supper every single evening, 40 years of habit. My father used to say a cluttered shop was how men lost fingers. But that night I forced myself to leave it untouched. I locked the door and went inside. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit upright in bed. Wind against the siding, branches scraping the windows, Duke growling softly near the door around 2 in the morning. By sunrise, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight and walked out to the workshop while frost still covered the grass. The second I stepped inside, I knew. Footprints. 2 distinct sets pressed clearly into the sawdust. One belonged to Trevor's heavy work boots. The other was narrower, running shoes. The tracks moved across the workshop floor toward an old steamer trunk sitting in the corner beneath some blankets that had belonged to my grandfather. The trunk had shifted several inches. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside sat a black duffel bag I had never seen before. I unzipped it carefully. Bricks of white powder, cash, small plastic baggies, a digital scale. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I sat down hard on the concrete floor as the truth slammed into me all at once. Trevor wasn't stealing my trees. The trees were just the beginning. He was setting me up. Drugs hidden on my property, a forged story ready to ruin me, maybe even a plan to declare me unstable and take the land permanently. 60 acres outside Red Deer worth millions once development reached this far north. And suddenly every fake smile Trevor had ever given me made perfect sense. If you've ever trusted somebody simply because they married into your family, subscribe to the channel, because betrayal cuts deeper when it comes wearing a familiar face. I grabbed my phone and started photographing everything. The footprints, the duffel bag, the trunk, every single detail. Because deep down I already understood one thing. If I made even one wrong move now, I might not survive what Trevor had planned for me. That same morning I drove straight into Red Deer and handed everything to my lawyer, Gordon McPherson, a man who had known me since high school. One look at the forged will was enough for him. "Don't call Trevor," he said quietly. "Don't warn anybody. Let the RCMP handle this." But before I went to the police, I made one more stop. I drove out to Rocky Mountain House looking for the old woman from the hardware store. Her name was Ingrid, and somehow she already knew why I had come. Over tea in her tiny kitchen, she told me about her own son who had stolen her family farm decades earlier, using forged papers and lies, almost identical to Trevor's plan. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I failed to save my husband," she whispered. "I wasn't going to fail you, too." I cried harder in that little kitchen than I had even at Margaret's funeral. The RCMP arrested Trevor 11 days later. Drugs, fraud, forgery. But the charge that still haunts me was attempted murder. Police found notes on his laptop detailing a plan to poison me during Christmas dinner and make it look like heart failure. My own son-in-law had been planning my funeral while smiling across my kitchen table. Caroline left him immediately. A few months later, she gave birth to my grandson, Oscar. These days, he sits beside me in the workshop, while I carve his name into a walnut blanket chest made from the very trees Trevor tried to steal. Funny how life works sometimes. One small act of kindness in a hardware store saved my land, my daughter, and maybe my life. So if this story touched something in you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone you love. Because sometimes the people who save us arrive looking like ordinary strangers standing quietly in line behind us. And out here on the Canadian prairies, the wind still carries warnings for those willing to listen.